Hello, my friends. Good evening. Hope that Yahweh is blessing you this day and especially tonight. I thank you for coming. We're going to talk about Paul among the Druids tonight. It's not a new discovery, an old discovery as part of tradition, that at Paul's house in Tarsus, maybe his parents' house, the house that he came up in, knowing that he was not born in Tarsus, somebody that should know, Jerome, who lived a number of years of his life with the Nazarenes in Israel, says that that is not true, that Paul wasn't born in Tarsus, but in Galilee. And on account of some kind of purge in Galilee, probably one of the wars between the Herods and King Aristus, maybe that his family flew from Galilee up to Tarsus and made their home with residence and with relatives up there, but found in the home, in the foundation, was a marble box. And in that marble box, a pair of shoes, Paul's shoes, and the text called the Apocalypse of Paul. I don't know if anybody's read that here, but the Apocalypse of Paul is all about journeys to heaven and to hell, and what you can expect in each of those places. I think that comes off from the part in 2 Corinthians where Paul talks about, I knew a man some 14 years ago, whether in the spirit or out, I do not know. I think he was talking about James there, because James had an apocalypse too. It goes more along with Paul's apocalypse, goes more along with James' theology than Paul's apocalypse does with Paul. But be that as it may, I want to start off the subject with the family of Caractacus. The family of Caractacus. Have you heard of Caractacus? If you're from British heritage, you should have. Also known as Caradoc, Caractacus. So we're talking now about the 40s, actually about 44 AD. We know that Claudius, the emperor of Rome, decided to take over Britain entirely. So he sent troops up to Britain. Once the troops were stationed in Britain, he came up himself to see what was going on, primarily though so he could take credit for what he considered to be a surefire victory over all the tribes of Britain. And yes, in those days, Britain was full of tribes, a lot of them, and they weren't really too friendly with each other either. So now let's go to what we call Wales. Any Welsh folk here besides me? I've got a Welsh grandmother. A Welsh grandmother who didn't know what Welsh rarebit is. Though I found out later that that was one of her signature dishes in cooking, but she'd never heard of it like that. Anyway, what it was called at that time was Siluria. And a particular tribe was the Iceni, that is spelled Icenii, pronounced Iceni. Maybe some of you are from the tribe of Icenians. Thank you, thank you. And we're going to look at a war chief there. I already gave you his name, Caractacus, the son of Saint King Bran the Blessed, or Bran, actually, B-R-A-N, and his wife, Cartismandua, and Caractacus was, as I mentioned, a war chief of the Icenies of Celeria, and he was one of the main, I guess, antagonists against the Britons at this particular time. And he won battles and lost battles against Claudia's troops. But then something happened. The Romans were able to capture his family, his wife and children. That is the wife and children of Caractacus. Let me show you a little family tree I whipped up here in the last 20 minutes. This is important for what we're going to talk about, because soon we're going to go to 2 Timothy and find some of these people. So here's King Bran of Fendigaid, who was married to Anna of Fendigaid, who was the daughter of Joseph of Arimathea, and his wife Anna, or Hannah. The patriarch of the family of the Iceni was a man, I don't know much about him, but his name was Lear Lediart. I don't know who he was married to, but I have read some that this Lear was the god of the sea. And of course, he'd be married to the goddess of the sun. That's legendary, of course, but here we have King Bran, who is very well attested to in Welsh poetry and I was going to say prehistoric, but early historic odes and dirges. And a union of Bran and Anna begot Caractacus and a couple brothers and sisters. I just didn't have time or room here to put on here. The main person we're talking about tonight, for a while anyway. And he was married to a woman of Celeria, Tegau, which means in ancient Welsh, something like the pretty golden breasts. Tegau of the pretty golden breasts. His kin, his children, included Lyn, Orgain, and a couple more. Orgain was married to a man sent by Rome from the Senate to Britain to be a helper to the general that was over all of Britain at this time, Eubulus Plautius. These are famous people. And I believe all of these people were primitive believers through the ministry of Joseph of Arimathea. Lyn, his name was Romanized to Linus. Orgain, her name was Romanized to Claudia, and for good reason, which I'll tell you in a minute. She was also called Gladys. Gladys means the princess. Princess Orgain, and I already mentioned Rufus Pudens. We got something to say about him. Well-known, real person in history. And all three of these people, the children of Caractacus and the spouses, I suppose. This one again was a Roman senator, second in charge of Britain with the Romans. All these purportedly ministered to Paul the night before his purported execution in about 68 AD. Now, maybe if you have a Bible or you want to turn here to 2 Timothy 4:21, we'll get on with this. Please try to remember this genealogical table. I believe that these people, these Solarians, these Druid people, they were all Druids up there at this time. We don't know hardly anything about the Druids, so if somebody tells you they're going to tell you all about the Druids, I don't know, there isn't much to tell, really. They didn't have writing like the rest of the world did. They did have some type of hieroglyphics that I've seen. I don't think they've ever been translated. I believe this family of Druids were converted by the Chaldees, that is, the foreigners. The Chaldees were Hebrew missionaries that came up almost directly after the time of the resurrection. And legend tells us that Joseph of Arimathea was the main person they called a Chaldee because he was successful. He was a tin merchant and he went all over the world. And tradition tells us that Yeshua, having no early history, was with his uncle or his father, Joseph of Arimathea, when he took these trips. There is a lot of research into this by people who actually believe that, should we call it a myth, legend, the legend of Joseph of Arimathea. And I mentioned last time that he purportedly ended up in Glastonbury and that he took the child Yeshua with him wherever he went. How could he do that? He could do that because Yeshua was branded. He was branded a mamzer, M-A-M-C-E-R. That is to say, a child born out of wedlock. A child born out of wedlock in Galilee at that time could not enter a synagogue, couldn't get an education in a synagogue, had no rights at all, and grew up being made fun of. So what we know is that Yeshua came back there as an adult in his ministry to the synagogue in Nazareth. Do know that what I am giving you tonight is neither fact nor fiction. This comes from, again, myths and legends, ancient stories, etc. But as I said, I believe there's some truth to these, especially one I'm going to mention here in 2 Timothy. So the children of the war chief, Caractacus, were captured by the Romans and taken off to Rome to hold until they got Caractacus. They were out to get him because he was the fiercest of the warriors and the leader of all the warriors in South Britain. Caractacus himself went to join up with another person in the north, a woman named Boudicca, who was the queen of the north of Britain. That's just the north of Britain was here at that time considered about a little south of the Scottish border. Now, this Boudicca, the Romans came up and not only demanded that her as the queen turned that country over to them, but they beat Boudicca to almost death and raped her two daughters. And so from then on, Boudicca was also a warrior, and you can read about her. I'm going to put her name in the chat, because if you're British or care anything about this kind of stuff, you need to look at Boudicca. Boudicca. We used to have a member of our group we called Boudicca. She was she was a war chief. Unfortunately, after several years with us, she changed her religion and she was gone. Boudicca. Boudicca called Britain to arms, not as a bunch of tribes, but as one body. But she didn't like Caractacus. So she turned him into the Romans under the guise of meeting him someplace. He just met Romans and they took him back to Rome to be executed. All right, so we have Caractacus and his family. And I think they took King Bran and his wife Cartismandua with them as well. I think they were there, and put them up in the palace until they could be put on display at a triumph of Claudia, that is a big parade where the war chief of the Romans would bring back hostages and all kinds of booty and stuff. Like when they beat Judea, they brought back the menorah and all the stuff from the temple to show. And then they would take their captives. They wanted to catch the leaders of their resistance alive, so they could put them to death in front of the people. Of course, at that time in Rome, there were games that would pit gladiators against themselves, that would pit gladiators against Christians, that would pit wild animals against Christians and other kinds of convicts at that time. And the people enjoyed it like we would enjoy a football game. Maybe you would enjoy a football game where you could get concessions like beer and you could get bread and all kinds of munchies, and they were free on the emperor. Just give them the games and they'll comply with anything you want. And that's just exactly what Nero and his predecessor, Claudius, and Tiberius did. So they were used to that kind of violence, and they just couldn't wait till the Romans came back for a triumph, because at that time, during the triumph, the emperor would ride in a coach and he would throw money out as he went. Not moon pies. He would throw money out and people would pick his money up and they would feel really blessed to have a nickel. Sometimes someone might get a few sesterces, maybe a gold coin. And that was a really fortunate thing. The people were very satisfied with this as long as they got their games and their free goodies. Caractacus was to be brought back after his trial at Rome and displayed as a war criminal and was to be executed. In Rome, not allowed to go back there for any reason, but Caractacus did something incredible, actually, because he was asked if he had one last wish. And his last wish, besides hoping to save his family from their public death, was to just speak a little bit before the Senate and the emperor, which he was given the opportunity to do. And of course, the Senate at this time was ready to drink blood. But Claudius was a strange fellow. The emperor was strange. His family all thought he was retarded his whole life until when Little Boots, Caligula, was assassinated. The Praetorian Guard thought, let's go get the retarded Claudius and make him the emperor, and we can do anything we want to after that. Well, they found out pretty quickly, though Claudius was hiding behind a curtain up in his bedroom, they did find him, but he wasn't the retarded man that everyone thought, and handicapped as well. He put all that on to keep from getting assassinated. He didn't want to be the emperor, but he took it, and I can't say that he was a real despot, but he was pretty bad too. And so Claudius directed him to come before the Senate to win his family a pardon. I have his speech here that he made. And I read this in the Annals of Tacitus, the Roman historian, of just a little later in history. And so this was about the time that Paul was preaching, James was preaching, Peter was traveling, everybody was going around. Some may have been in Rome. Of course, it is said that Paul and Peter were both in Rome, and at the same time, in a later episode, I will give you some of the stories of Paul and Peter in Rome. They're very entertaining, I can say that. So Tacitus preserved the speech of Caractacus before the Roman Senate, and here it is. My present lot is as glorious to you as it is degrading to me. I had men and horses, arms and wealth. What wonder if I parted with them reluctantly? If you Romans choose to lord it over the whole world, does it follow that the world is to accept your slavery? Were I to have been at once delivered up as a prisoner, neither my fall nor your triumph would have become famous. My punishment would be followed by oblivion. Whereas, if you save my life, I shall be an everlasting memorial of your clemency. That's an excerpt from the speech from Tacitus. And by the time he was done, this Caractacus, as an orator, had the Senate and the emperor eating out of his hands. He pardoned him and his whole family, and Claudius invited the family to dine with him and to live in the royal palace with him in their own apartments. Now, we saw that these children of Caractacus were Lynn and Urgain, or Gladys. I mentioned that Gladys isn't a name, but a title. That's the Princess Urgain. But you see Lynn in his Roman name in 2 Timothy. Oh, where is it exactly? Chapter 4, I think 21. And you see his sister there named Claudia. Well, this child bride of Rufus Pudens, the senator, Claudius, a much older man, probably in his 50s at this time. By the way, he died too, executed by his wife, Caligula's sister, with a poison mushroom. Some of you wives might want to use that idea sometime. Feed him a poison mushroom. Better have a lot of poison though. this Claudia was actually Ergain, or Gladys as she was called. Claudius, the old man, fell in love with her. Yes, and adopted her. And when he adopted Ergain, he gave her a name, and he named her after himself. So we have a Linus, a Roman name, and a Claudia, a Roman name, brother and sister. And the Claudia was married to the senator, Rufus. They had met in Britain during the war. And of course, they were on different sides of the war, but somehow they had gotten married in Britain. And there are legends that Paul was there for this when it happened. And that Paul, of course, where would he hang around in Britain? Well, it's St. Paul's, where St. Paul's Cathedral is in London. That was Paul's stomping grounds in the places that he stayed at that time with Rufus Pudens and a few other of the gang that we read about in the scripture. So that's how Claudia got her name, and that's how she got her husband. She was lovely, so outgoing and winning that Claudius adopted her as his own and named her after himself. And that kind of solidified the Julia-Claudian family with the family of Bran the Blessed, or the family of Caractacus, actually. And they all lived happily ever after and were able to go back to Wales at one time. In the meantime, Boudicca in North England, Angleterre, got all the tribes of Britain together and made one fantastic battle against the Romans in the entire land. And that battle has been historically written down by people that were there, like General Agricola and other ones, and put the story together, and you can read it in the annals of Tacitus. It's incredible. They almost destroyed the entire Roman army there. But Boudicca made a mistake when she had the generals of the Romans locked up in one of the pagan palaces there. She could have burned the place down and killed them all. But instead, she poisoned herself. Nobody knows why. Maybe of seeing so many dead and being a part of so many killings in the battle. If you like that, I mean, I really enjoy war stories primarily for the kinds of strategies. Strategies in war can be used also in peace. We're bringing forth even the chronicles of the Messiah in our lifetime. And if you heard the message I gave, I don't know, a week or two ago, called The Third Way, James the Just in the Third Way, you can see how clever Messiah could be in the presence of sons of the devil. Aulus Plautius, in the meantime, was the first Roman governor of Britain, and another one of the generals in Britain. You should know this name, Flavius Vespasianus, Vespasian, the one that destroyed Israel, was also there getting his training at this time. And I think I said before, but I think this is about 44 AD. He and his son were brought into the battle against Israel decades later and finally subdued Israel, as you know, completely by 73 AD, destroying the temple in 70 and maybe seeing the rapture happen there in Jerusalem in 70 AD, which I talked about back weeks ago, maybe a month ago or so. My belief is the rapture did happen, and I have plenty of evidence for it happening in 70 AD. All I need is ears ready to hear. Ears ready to hear. That's not to say that Yahshua would evacuate people in the future the same way. Oh, I wanted to go off on a tangent here, but I'm going to save it. So when Aulus Plautius was recalled to Rome, it got out among the Roman citizenry that his wife, Pomponia Graecina, Aulus Plautius' wife, Pomponia Graecina, hey, if you went out and saw Quo Vadis, you already know what I'm talking about. But Graecina was a secret Nazarene, having been converted in Britain while her husband was out fighting the battles. So that word got out, and in Rome, she was picked up by the guard to be tried for foreign superstition, which was a crime that received capital punishment if found guilty. Foreign superstition. Fortunately for her, her husband loved her, and he was a secret Nazarene too, Aulus Plautius. And in the law of the Romans, which one was it? Lex Julia law, named after Augustus' terrible daughter, Julia. The lawyer that was chosen to prosecute a wife gone bad was her husband. And again, Tacitus tells us about this, that she was acquitted of foreign superstition after her husband pled against her in the court. He was the prosecutor. That sounds a little strange, doesn't it? Or maybe it was love. So on to Rufus Pudens. We mentioned before that Gladys, Urgain, Claudia, the Druid princess, married Rufus Pudens, an aide to Plautius and Roman senator, in about 53 AD. They had met in Britain as enemies. When the family of Caractacus were brought down into exile to Rome, Rufus joined her as well. They had 4 children of Druid and Roman royalty. One of those was a man named Timothy. The others were Novatus, Praxedes, and Pudentiana. And the last one there, Pudentiana, was a martyr, and I understand that Novatus was an evangelist. And they were all part of this foreign Judaic superstition, not of the Pauline brand, but of the Torah brand. Now is a good time to look at 2 Timothy 4:21. And we'll go to Romans 16 after that, where Paul is writing, do your best to come before winter. Eubulus sends greetings to you. Now, Eubulus, that is a nickname. It means good Bulus. EU, means good. It's a Greek name and a Roman name. and it is short or a nickname for Aristobulus. Keep that in mind as we go down a little bit. Eubulus sends greetings to you, as do Pudens and Linus and Claudia and all the brethren. If Paul is writing this, then he is with these Druids. And he undoubtedly met them when he was in Britain, as the story went 2 weeks ago that I read to you, Paul in Britain, an excerpt. So here we have Paul among senators, among soldiers. Remember Paul coming back through Europe? He preached in the soldiers' barracks all the way back. Was he a Roman citizen? Well, some people say that's impossible. I believe that he was. How in the world was he able to preach through Roman fortresses? I believe that that's true. So here we have Paul at St. Paul's, before it was St. Paul's, in Britain, and now coming back here through continental Europe. So this Eubulus, which again means good Aristobulus, plus the Roman senator Rufus Pudens, plus his Druid princess wife Claudia, and Linus, the second pope. You hear me? Linus the Pope, her brother, the Druid Pope, both children of King Caractacus of Siluria in Britain, poor king, captured to be exiled and then exterminated. Now, all of these are together in Rome. Is Timothy in Rome? And is this Timothy that I mentioned, Timotheus, where is he again? The child of Rufus and Claudia. Is that the Timothy here it's being written to? It sure could be. Timotheus would have been a Druid as well. Now, I'm not talking about religion Druid here. I'm talking about Druid culture, which was very, very different than Roman culture, which you can look up in your own time. And so here we have a very interesting place where Paul is and whom his friends are. And this is one of the reasons that 2 Timothy, for sure, is considered not one of Paul's letters. It's considered a pseudepigrapha, one written in Paul's name, a false writing, pseudepigrapha. Linus, let's go on a little bit with him, was to serve as the second bishop of Rome after Peter and before Clement, who is also signaled out in Paul's letters. Why didn't they teach me this in church? I would have liked to know that. Britons would be proud of that. Very proud. Finally, to Rufus again, Rufus Pudens. Take a look at Romans 16:13 if you want to, or write it down for later. Nobody argues about this being a Pauline letter, where he says, greet Rufus, eminent in the master, also his mother and mine. Paul is saying that Rufus Pudens' mother was also his mother. What do you think of that? A kinsman, at any rate. What a surprise. Paul and Senator Rufus Pudens were also at least half brothers, at least cousins. They had the same mother. Don't tell me that Paul had to go out and skin cows and work with that. I don't know if you've ever known a mule skinner, but I've known a coon skinner. And I remember his little shack out in the backyard of his house. He'd go out and shoot these coons and I'd bring them in, and he would skin them during the day. And there, the smell that came out of that place, I was just a young elementary school kid, and the rats that were running in and out of there were disgusting. Did Paul do that kind of work? I think that tent maker is a euphemism for something else. It just simply meant that he made his own living. And I guess he probably could. I suspect that what's her name? Is it from Romans? Corinthians? I think it's from Corinthians that Chloe's people, you remember Chloe's people? He's writing one of these letters. First Corinthians, I can't remember for sure. I don't know why this slipped me. But one of those letters he's writing really to Chloe, who is the head of some kind of manufacturing, though it was unusual for a woman to render a factory. Here was one that did, and her people, that means euphemistically, her slaves. So at least we know that Paul had a sponsor here, and a sponsor that was certainly very well blessed with money to help support him. And that's why I believe that he was writing the news to her as well. Not to mention Paul's Herodian kinspeople that we've already looked at. Now, there was a poet back in those days. His name was Martial, M-A-R-T-I-A-L. And he knew Rufus Pudens and wrote a limerick about him. I think this is a limerick or part of one. He writes, recalling how Pudens behaved, some marveled when he got saved. Then he lived a good life with his dear savage wife. Now in scripture, his name is engraved. That comes back from the time when scripture was being formed. Martial, the poet, the satirist, writing this little lyric about Pudens, and what he's saying there is that he was the life of the party, but he married a savage wife, a Druid wife, and now his name is found in the Holy Scriptures, engraved there. Let's see what else I have here. So this Rufus Pudens, a Roman nobleman, became a believer of the Chaldean. Did I talk about that? Those were the first Hebrew missionaries. Tradition tells us were led by Shimon, Simon, the brother of Yeshua, also known as Simon the Zealot, and Simon the Canaanian. And this is the same Simon that was crucified in 90 AD, who was the head of the assembly of Yahweh in Jerusalem by this time. And Domitian got him. Domitian arrested him, but let him go. And then is it Hadrian, the one before Trajan. Trajan got him, that particular emperor, and crucified him. Just think, Shimon, Yeshua, Yaakov, Yehuda, all these were hunted down and executed. The whole family, practically. We don't know about the younger brother, Yosei, but if you remember in the Jesus family tomb, there was a Yosei bone box in there. We think that Theudas and Yehuda are the same people. Theudas is spoken of by Gamaliel in Acts chapter 6, where Gamaliel is telling the council there to remember these guys and how rotten they were. Yehuda was, his head was cut off, is what the legend tells us. So the savage wife civilized Pudens, Rufus Pudens, or was it the spirit who indwelt Pudens as a Nazarene believer? Well, you can see more about that in Ephesians 1 and Romans 8, if you feel like it, which brings us to a perfect segue into Paul as a Roman. Oh, I want to go on with this. It's been an hour almost. Yeah, I think so. Let's finish this up, this part. Paul claims that he was a Roman citizen. Actually, not only he claims that, but Luke claims it too in Acts 21. Seeing as how he was a Herodian and very close with the royal Claudian dynasty and with the Neronic dynasty. Remember, Seneca, the guardian of Nero, was Paul's pen pal. Oh, but I haven't gotten into that yet. He was intimately involved with Claudius's adopted Druid daughter, as we just showed, the blood daughter of Caractacus, the king of the Silurians. This was made quite clear. He was also intimately involved with her husband, Rufus Pudens, a Roman senator, just to once again summarize. All saints greet you, especially those in Caesar's household, writes Paul in Philippians 4:22. I'm wondering, has every Bible scholar, friend and foe, read this? Philippians 4:22, where Paul is greeting on behalf of Caesar's household. How does he get there? He's in the palace, as well as his saints that are in Rome. They're with Caesar. Philippians 4:22. In addition, Paul speaks at length about his secretary, Epaphrodites, also known as Epaphras in the New Testament, in Philippians 2:25 and following, Colossians 1:7, and Philippians, Philemon, 23. There was only one prominent person with this name at that time, Epaphroditus. Epaphroditus was also the secretary of Nero, of Vespasian, of Titus, and of Domitian, there for 30-some years, secretary of the emperors. Epaphroditus and friend of Paul. And I can also say that it looks to me like Epaphroditus, who was on the ship with Paul, because Paul says in Philippians that he left Epaphroditus because he was sick. On their journey, he got sick, and Paul left him someplace to get well. Later on, he gets well. This is the secretary, scribe, and personal manager for Nero, Vespasian, Titus, and Domitian. Epaphroditus is the same one who assisted Nero, the beast of Revelation, in his suicide in 68 AD. And I'll quote again here, that Nero, I quote, still could not bring himself to take his own life when he flew from the palace into Epaphroditus' basement. Instead, he forced his private secretary, Epaphroditus, to perform the task. It's amazing. I believe that the writer of the Gospel of Luke and the Acts of the Apostles, at least part of them, was none other than Epaphroditus. I believe that Luke, a name that came for his gospel and his acts, came along generations after those texts were written and put on there by the so-called church fathers at that time. The names of the authors of the Gospels are fantasy. I'm sorry, but this is one of the first things they teach you in a good liberal Bible academy, because it's true. The mystery on these things is history. And it behooves our pastors not to speak of it, not to teach it, and any conservative Bible school not to touch those things. They never do, they never will, because they believe that it's best to keep the believers ignorant of these things. Because once you get past the myths, you can get on to the facts of these things. And there's much to find in the New Testament, especially Acts, that we can parlay into great historical truth rather than legend. Do I think that the Bible is inspired? Yes, of course I do, especially the Tanakh. Do I think it is without error, inerrant? No, not at all. Anything humans touch is in error. What I was taught as a boy in the Sunday school was that God got a hold of these people and caused them to write on a paper without even knowing what they were writing. That's what I was taught. And I kept thinking about that and thinking about it. And when I got a little older, I saw that that is called automatic writing. And any number of dead people take part in automatic writing. Well, you take, for instance, the Gospel of the Holy 12. Some of you have read that. That's unfortunate. It's a counterfeit gospel. It was channeled through an Episcopal priest by 3 dead people. And if you go to the original foreword of the Gospel of the Holy 12, original foreword, you will find that that is true. If you're reading that and believing it, the Aquarian Gospel, the Jesus in India Gospel, these things have been acquired through automatic writing from dead people, demons. Besides that, I'm not saying this against Paul. I'm saying that certainly Paul used these connections to his advantage, and that Paul's writings are absolutely invaluable. Invaluable? Extremely valuable to us as historical records. Without Paul's writings, I couldn't come up with this stuff, which I believe to be true stories of a Paul who has secular friends, a Paul that probably went bowling once in a while, a Paul who probably drank a glass of wine once in a while, a Paul that was in many ways just like us. Right. So Paul was also on intimate terms with the next dynasty after the Julia-Claudian dynasty. That is the Flavians, who I mentioned already earlier today, Vespasian, Titus, Domitian. And let's see, we also have an association here in Philippians 4:3, where Paul says, I ask you also, true yoke fellow. It's either true yoke fellow or a person named Syzygus. I like that name, Syzygus. Some English Bibles try to translate that as true yoke fellow. He says, help these women, for they have labored side by side with me in the gospel together with Clement and the rest of my fellow workers whose names are in the book of life. Who's this Clement? Well, I let the cat out of the bag last week. Clement is hailed by the Roman Church to be the third or fourth Bishop of Rome, the third or fourth Pope. I say third or fourth because some of their records say third and some say fourth. He is also purported to be the writer of the Nazarene Acts of the Apostles, the counter Acts, which are the Acts of Peter, who he certainly knew well. Clement was a cousin to Emperor Titus Flavius Vespasian. He was his cousin to the emperor. Clement and the emperor were cousins. Paul and Clement were good friends. Paul, I should say, Peter and Clement were associated. Clement also wrote the letters of First Clement, and some think that he wrote Second Clement as well, and I have done lectures on them already, where Clement has found schism in the Corinthian church about 10, 15 years after Paul was there. That's very interesting that the Corinthian church would soon after Paul left have a second schism that was officiated by Clement. We also imagine that Paul was intimate with Vespasian's brother, the city manager of Rome, whose name was Titus Flavius Sabinus. And we see all these Flavians, including Flavius Josephus as well, all there in Rome, all knowing Clement because of his relationship by blood to these guys, and also Paul through Clement and through Seneca, Paul's Paul's pen pal. There we go. This city manager, Titus Flavius Sabinus, also was known as Theophilus, maybe the same one that Luke or Epaphrodites addresses in the Gospel and Acts. Theophilus is in code. TFS, Theophilus, Titus Flavius Sabinus. So there you have, from the very mind of Paul Meyer, who this Theophilus that Luke writes to is, that is the mayor of Rome, brother to the emperor. And since we can definitely make parallels between Luke and Acts and the antiquities of the Jews, especially Acts, there are unbelievable parallels between Josephus' writings and so-called Luke's writing that was this Josephus that was adopted into the family of the Flavians in the Jewish War of 66 to 73. Joseph even wrote about a Saul and his brother, Costabar, remember him? Calling them ringleaders of a riot in Jerusalem somewhere between 68 and 70 AD. There's a lot in Josephus about Saulus. And at least personality-wise, it fits Paul pretty darn well. It happens where Paul is. By the way, Saul is mentioned directly after Josephus describes the stoning of James, the master's brother, whom we also took care of a week or so ago. Finally, I haven't gotten into this much, but we will in the future. There's a series of letters existing, spurious or not. They seem pretty realistic to me, between Paul and again Nero's guardian Seneca. Seneca was the richest man in the world, the richest. He made his riches by stealing land in Britain from the British and then selling it in Rome. He was also the wise philosopher that people still read today. You can still get his books, all of them, on Amazon now after 2,000 years. So with that and the promise of dealing with Seneca next, we're going to leave Paul with his Roman citizenship, having explored at least the tip of the iceberg, and there is more. Questions, comments? Just be sure to understand that if you're trying to find somebody's life that has been written down in a book and you don't have any information about, well, about them, I can't, there. I'm trying to get back to Zoom again. Where are you? You see my face on Zoom? There.
Yep.
Finally found it. Sometimes you're going to make discoveries that seem to be good or seem to be bad about sleuthing down somebody in history's life. Look what they did with, who's the guy's name from Tyana? Apollonia of Tyana. What Philostratus did with his life. Philostratus, a little past the time of Paul, wrote a life of this guy, but he wrote Paul's and Yeshua's life into this guy's biography, where things Paul did and things Yeshua did, Philostratus, the writer, just pretty much took Paul's and Yeshua's names out of there and put Apollonius of Tyana's name in there. And I'm still seeing on Facebook people saying, well, Paul's really this guy, or Jesus is really this guy. Apollonius? I'm going to have to see if that's true. Let's see. Apollonius of Tyana, his biographer, so-called, was Philostratus. And in those books, Apollonius is actually Paul and Jesus and a few others put in, and people read that and believe it. Nonsense. Because somebody ought to debunk that. Okay, I see that there isn't a bunch of chats here. Yeah, there you go. Thank you. Good for Steve. Philostratus. Yes, and thank you very much for coming. And perhaps we can do this Thursday again. Watch on Facebook. I'll put a notice up there. All right? May Yahweh be with you again. And you pray for me, if you would.